Hi, my name is Ram Krishna Sharma, and today I'd like to talk to you about 7 ways you can handle your stress as a student. Before I actually break it down and talk about 7 concrete ways you can tackle your stress, I first want to talk about why you would be interested as a student, just like me, why you would be interested in actually wanting to handle your stress. What is the incentive underpinning this desire? And I find it very resourceful to actually quote a couple studies so that we can actually have more grounded reasons and it can fuel our desire for wanting to know why we should handle our stress. And the first academic study is that stress, higher levels of stress, actually corresponds to this idea of us having higher levels of cortisol in our brain. Now, cortisol is a chemical in our brain that is released or produced by our bodies when we are stressed to a higher extent. And it's often called the stress hormone. That's what they call cortisol. And why we care is because higher levels of stress and therefore higher levels of cortisol correspond to a vast array of physical and psychological effects. And so these effects in turn impact our quality of life, and our quality of life, of course, impacts us. So higher levels of cortisol when we face higher levels of stress actually leads to a couple physical ailments such as fatigue, headaches, intestinal problems. Irritable bowel syndrome is actually a very common one amongst people who are chronically stressed. And it also leads to anxiety and depression. So both of the latter half symptoms are sort of psychological elements, but they too in turn have physical consequences as well. So cortisol is sort of dangerous, right? I mean, just the way that I'm making it sound, it's very dangerous. So we want to be able to sort of come up with ways that we can actually concretely handle our stress and sort of lower our level of cortisol. And not completely, right? Because some stress, as per certain studies show, some stress is actually beneficial for us. There was a study done by a group of surveyors, and essentially what they found was that students who reported higher levels of stress for a shorter period of time, let's say amongst a few weeks or so, they actually reported higher levels of academic achievement. And this was backed by concrete records of how they achieved, as opposed to another group of students who reported chronic stress. So this isn't short-term stress. This is chronic stress over a longer period of time. You would expect that, hey, if people in the short term are stressed and are overachieving, then perhaps if they're stressed for a longer period of time, perhaps they would overachieve as well for a longer period of time. But that actually wasn't true, as it turned out. If you're chronically stressed, then your academic performance or performance in general tends to decrease. And if you're stressed over a short period of time to a certain extent, your academic performance or performance in increases. And this leads us back to something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which states that there is a certain level of stress which is actually beneficial, as we found with the students. And then everything beyond that point, everything thereafter, would actually lead to physical consequences and mental consequences that would actually decrease performance. So our intention is to be at that level of stress that is healthy, and then treat or cure the level of stress or manage the level of stress that we see on the latter half of the Dodson graph, which is a graphical interpretation of what level of stress is right for you. And so that's sort of the motive underpinning this video. Clearly, evidence shows that higher level of stress for an academic student or a student in general or a person in general is detrimental to physical and mental health. And therefore, how can we treat that? This presentation will actually focus a little more on the academic side of things for a student, how a student can handle stress. But a key takeaway is that the type of treatment that is effective for you depends on the type of stress. So before we actually talk about how we can treat stress, let's first preface with what are some common stressors in the environment of an academic student. So common stressors for college students, right, or even high school or middle school students. The first is social stressors, right? These are stressors that relate to, let's say, peer pressure. Perhaps people are pressuring you to make certain decisions that you feel aren't in the best interest of yourself, and that can be stressful. Another very common stressor in terms of social stressors is your social life, right? Social relationships are not at all simple or straightforward. They're very complex and they require a lot of energy and thought. And therefore, it's not uncommon for one to be stressed regarding social situations. And this can then be further extended to relationships, which is also another type of social relationship. Romantic relationships are also very complicated, very stressful. And there's a lot that can go into these types of relationships because there's a lot to consider. And so this type of consideration and complexity leads to overthinking, which itself can lead to a higher level of stress. There's a lot that goes on there in this paradigm. Your self-esteem is at risk. Your performance is at risk. How you present yourself to the world is at risk. Your ego is at risk. There's a lot going on. You have to sort of adjust yourself towards another person and their life and their schedule and their demands. And that can be very taxing, both mentally and physically. So that's also a key part of a key contributor in terms of being stressed. And of course, it goes without saying that there are academic stressors. There are tests, there are deadlines, there are expectations that other people have for you that you want to meet out. And perhaps you feel inadequate in certain regards. Perhaps you don't think that those expectations are in line with your ability. And perhaps that can lead to stress as well. Academic performance in general is a huge stressor because it relates to our goals. We want to achieve our goals, and academic performance stands in the way of that. And if we can't overcome certain academic obstacles, then perhaps we won't achieve our goals. So that actually leads to insecurity, which is also just a form of stress. And there are also financial stresses, right? I mean, if one wants to pursue academic goals, they have to be able to sustain that financially. So there is this whole idea of whether or not I'll receive aid, or perhaps whether or not I'll receive a scholarship. And if neither of those work out, or even if those work out, perhaps you're pursuing a part-time or even a full-time job. That can be very stressful, balancing deadlines, expectations, so on and so forth of a job, but then also balancing expectations and so on and so forth of a academic institution. And so if you have both of these combined, one in itself is stressful, but if you have both of these combined, then it in turn can be very stressful. So now we're going to sort of transition into talking about the first type of method that we can use in order to combat our stress. And this stress, this solution ties into deadlines and tests and how we can essentially tackle our tasks. So this solution is correlated with that particular type of stressor, because I think I mentioned before that the type of stress is extremely important when considering what type of method you want to impose as a solution. So the first is organization. And there are many types of organization, but organization in general can help you alleviate stress, because if you think about it, many of us are stressed about the unknown. If you've ever heard of the very famous phrase, the fear of the unknown, well, this relates very closely to that. If you are working a job and you're also part of an academic institution, then there are a lot of knowns that can potentially become unknowns. And so what I mean by that is, the deadlines and expectations and meetings and class times and lectures and when you have to show up for your shift, all of this is very concrete and it's outlined in advance for you if you're fortunate. Maybe it's not always like that, but most times it is. So the responsibility falls on us to be able to consolidate that information from these sources and adjust it around our schedule and to see if it fits and to see how we can flexibly sort of mend our schedule in a way so that we can support these obligations. So the responsibility is on us, but it may be unknown in the sense that we may not be able to always pay attention to these deadlines, or we may sometimes forget to refer to where this information is stored. And so organization plays a key role because it can aggregate this information in, let's say, the form of a calendar. So a monthly calendar that you can plan, that you can sort of fill on a day-to-day, weekly basis, can essentially tell you what you should do day-to-day, week-to-week, or even month-to-month. And what this does is it consolidates that information from both these sources so that you don't have to constantly look around towards several sources of information. For instance, a lot of the information that pertains to academics is stored on Canvas in different courses. And a lot of the information that is essentially that pertains to our job is essentially stored somewhere else. A weekly, monthly calendar can aggregate that information so that you can look at this little box that essentially is like a little checklist for the day, and it can elaborate a little bit on what you have to do at what time. And if you'd like, you can then further investigate what those obligations are, but at least you know what they are. And so what that does is it establishes a sense of certainty. And this sense of certainty gives us peace of mind because we are not constantly thinking about, we're not insecure about whether or not we forgot the details about what needs to be done. And so that peace of mind itself is a combat to a very well-known stressor, which is the fear of the unknown. So that is a huge, huge benefit. Now, the other type of organization that I wanted to talk about was ensuring that your immediate environment is organized in terms of your belongings and your living situations. So what I mean by that is, of course, we can organize our deadlines and obligations in terms of timings and where we have to be and so on and so forth. But another type of organization is that of our belongings, right? I mean, we can't do anything without our belongings. You can't take a test without a pen or paper. You can't participate in a course without your books. You can't, practice effective transport to your institution without a bag. Perhaps you can't take a chemistry quiz without your calculator. All of these are very important instruments that contribute to our academic success. And what I'm really trying to say here is that without organizing these materialistic physical belongings, we are prone to putting ourselves in situations that can essentially prompt uncomfortable feelings when we don't have these materialistic tools that can help us excel. So by us being able to organize our tools, organize our belongings, we can better tackle the academic goals or objectives that are essentially going to lead us to our overall goal. So it's very important. And of course, this ties into basically your clothes, or perhaps your room, or your house or your living room. Keeping these places organized constantly puts us in a living situation that seems more it seems more certain. There's a level of certainty that you have if you are positioned in an environment where everything is where it's supposed to be, because that itself gives us certainty. It is no longer the fear of the unknown. I don't know where my calculator is. I don't know where my papers are, so on and so forth. All of this is like a fear of the unknown. And so once this fear is alleviated, there's a sense of a certainty, and this sense of certainty is very, very comforting. And it can help us materialistically achieve our goals and give us this mental peace of mind. Another thing that I wanted to talk about as a common combat to a very common stressor is exercise. So I talked about organization, if perhaps your stress relates to academic stress, but I'd like to also talk about exercise. And exercise combats a very broad array of stressors. It can combat academic stress. It can combat self-esteem. Maybe your stress relates to self-esteem. It can combat that type of stress. And it can improve your memory, it can improve your grades, so on and so forth. And we'll talk about that. But the main point is that exercise is a great combat to different types of stressors. Scientifically, biologically, neurologically, we know that cortisol is essentially that stress hormone, and exercise directly reduces this stress hormone, and it reduces cortisol, and that of course correlates to a reduced level of stress. So if higher cortisol essentially is attributed towards higher levels of physical ailments, then exercise, knowing that it would decrease cortisol, would essentially knock you out of that bond of being with high level of cortisol and perhaps a high level of physical ailments attached to having a high level of cortisol. It also stimulates endorphins, and this chemical, if you've heard of it, is essentially responsible for elevating our mood. And that is sort of like a quick fix, right? It's not long-term unless you make it long-term, but it's essentially a quick fix that can give you a high level of endorphins immediately. It can increase your dopamine, increase your serotonin, and this elevates your mood immediately. And what this does is, even though it's short-term, it puts you in a situation where you can then address situations that were stressing you before. So if perhaps you were stressed about your relationship, right? And you were having trouble communicating, and perhaps you were in a fight, exercise can elevate your mood. And with that elevated mood, you are now a better person to then address that situation with a better frame of mind, just because you're in a better mood. It's better than saying, if you were in a bad mood, would that have worked out if you were to address that same situation? And the answer is probably no. It's better to be in a better mood. And so exercise, given that it increases your mood, can essentially allow you to tackle situations that are stressful in a better frame of mind. It can also help you improve your sleep. And I'm going to sort of just keep this point floating here to the side, because sleep in itself is a huge combat to multiple types of stressors, and I have it reserved on our to-do list of which solutions to actually look at. So I'm just going to leave that at that, but you should also just know that at this stage, exercise also helps improve your sleep. And, you know, practically speaking, it makes you a little more exhausted. And at the end of the day, you know, you feel like you can get to sleep better. And so it increases your, it improves your level of sleep. Now, I said before that it is a short-term boost. And I meant that in the sense that if you go exercise and you come back, you're probably in a better mood. But it's not going to do anything for you day to day if you're not exercising day to day. So exercise is great for a short-term boost, but sustained exercise, regular exercise, can actually impact your memory and your cognitive ability. It can increase the volume of the hippocampus, and the hippocampus in turn is responsible for parts of your brain or that essentially connect networks, which essentially increase your memory. And so that's also a very key component in terms of exercise being able to help you handle stress. And if you're academically stressed, then this has implications for you, because a higher, an enhanced memory can essentially lead to better test scores and better academic performance. So if you're academically stressed, this is also an exceptional way to deal with that. I'd now like to talk about another type of combat to being stressed, which is socialization. Now, you've probably heard the phrase, we're social animals. And that's a very interesting phrase because of what it implies. It implies that, we're social animals, which means that there is some kind of biological component to us that essentially wants to socialize and is better off socializing. It's sort of this biological preference, right? If some people say that if you're not socializing, then it's not healthy. And that's sort of a weird thing to say because it implies that not socializing has implications for our biological, physical well-being, and it does. People who are unsocialized, studies show that they tend to have shorter lifespans, as opposed to the contrary, which is people who are better socialized have longer lifespans. And how it relates to stress? Well, socialization, when you're socializing with someone, it increases your hormones of oxytocin, and this directly decreases anxiety. And so anxiety is, of course, a type of stress. When I say insecurity, when I say anxiety, both of these lead to stress. So both of them can be considered as a point of stress. So socialization leads to, oxytocin, and it decreases your anxiety. So that's a great plus. But another thing is that it establishes a support system. Making friends and socializing with your friends and talking to them when you're stressed gives you a different perspective. You're dealing with another person who cares about you. They have an incentive towards you, but they also have something very beneficial that they can offer to you, which is a different frame of mind. Their thought process is very different than your thought process. So if you're essentially pursuing a thought process that is detrimental or can potentially lead to a negative consequence without you knowing it, then they can look at that from a spectator point of view, and they can take a step back because they're not jumbled in your thought pattern, right? They don't have the assumptions that you have. They're not making the assumptions that you're making that are leading you to essentially pursue this thought pattern. So when you're socializing with someone, they can take a step back for you and say, hey, this particular part of your thought process seems a little off tuned. And you may not have noticed that because it's very hard to observe yourself, right? The observer observing the observer, right? That's a very, it's very hard to get lost in that. But they, since they have an incentive towards you, can essentially look at your thoughts for what they are from a different perspective, and they can give you a different line of thought. And perhaps that line of thought is enough to essentially take care of a situation that was causing you stress. So it establishes a support system for help and advice. It's also a recreational activity too, and which can elevate your mood, and it can make you laugh, and so on and so forth. So socialization is an absolute golden key for relieving stress. Another thing I'd like to talk about in terms of a stress combat is meditation. Now, meditation, the internet is very dense, and the scientific literature is very dense with how meditation influences the chemical aspects of our brains in favor for reducing stress and stressful situations, or reducing stress in the sense that it can help us combat stressful situations, which would in turn reduce stress. When you're meditating, there is this idea of observing your thoughts without any kind of personal attachment. So when you're meditating, you are actually almost doing what your friend would have done for you. If you remember when I was talking about socialization, what I said was that it's very important for someone else to observe your thoughts from an unbiased perspective, such that they could observe parts of your thought pattern that are particularly vulnerable to fallacious thought. When you're meditating, you're almost doing the same thing because you're taking a step back and you're observing your thoughts in an unbiased manner. That's often what you're told when you're meditating. Observe your thoughts from an unbiased perspective. Take a step back and look at your thoughts and just spectate, observe them. Don't get attached to the feeling. Just think about the feeling, right? Think about its presence. And so when you're doing that, you are in fact taking a step back for yourself, and you're looking at it from a spectator's point of view, it can give you a lot of calm, because this practice of looking at it as if though you were a spectator disassociates you from the situation. And that disassociation is perhaps enough to knock you out of this paralysis of being stressed. It disassociates you. It separates you from that negative mental atmosphere, and that itself can help alleviate stress. And it can offer you a new perspective as well. And so that's for those of us who are stressed because of depression or anxiety. But another type of category of people is perhaps those who are stressed due to academic stressors. And the idea here is that if you're stressed due to your academic deadlines and tests and quizzes and so on and so forth, then meditation actually directly improves your memory. It can not only do that, but it can directly improve your sleep, because when you're sleeping, you actually access, so out of, let's say, 8 hours of the night, you access a specific portion of time, what they call REM sleep. And REM sleep is essentially this time of your sleep cycle where that is where all the beneficial effects of sleep are happening. That is where your brain is restoring itself to maximum capacity. That is where, let's say, you're dreaming, and that is a part of REM sleep, right? And that is where your body is getting maximum rest. And so meditation actually induces much of it puts you in a pseudo state of REM sleep, kind of. Not a pseudo state, but it very well replicates the effects of REM sleep and puts you in that REM state. And therefore, it's restorative in the sense that it can put you in that state, and therefore you can access the benefits of being in that state. But it also essentially, and so better sleep, better memory, right? Better academic performance. That's the chain of causation. But it also enhances your learning and attention because it enhances your memory. Your memory plays a pivotal role in academic success because you don't actually always have notes on hand when taking a test. So if you have better memory, it is safe to say that you will be in a better position to academically achieve in the way that you want, such that you can pursue your overarching objective. And it also increases attention span. And all of these are scientifically proven. And like I said, the internet is very dense with what chemicals contribute to some of these advantages. And the thing that I want to say is that it may not directly solve the situation that you're stressed about, but it will put you in a better frame of mind in order to do so. Then there's this other side of it, of meditation, that meditation actually decreases these these inflammatory chemicals, cytokine, which actually fuel depression. So being able to tackle that is also a very good advantage. Recreational activity. This is sort of an inclination that everyone has. If they're stressed, perhaps they go out drinking with friends, perhaps they watch a TV show, perhaps they do something that can immediately put them in a state that releases dopamine. That's essentially what's happening. When you're stressed and you're feeling depressed, and you essentially engage in an activity that you find fun and engaging, you immediately release dopamine and you immediately release stress. Because what's happening when you're depressed is your levels of one factor of it is that your levels of dopamine are below a level that is normal. And the inclination everyone has very naturally, without even knowing that this is a combat to stress, is they divert immediately towards engaging themselves in an activity which they find fun. And indirectly, what they're doing is they're increasing their level of dopamine and serotonin, which is in and of itself a combat to stress. So this is what, everyone does this. It's no surprise, but perhaps doing it intentionally can help. If you're very stressed, perhaps you should say, you know what, maybe I should take a break for an hour or two and do something that I like. And this can refresh your mind and put you in a position where you are now in a better frame of mind, in a better relaxed state to handle a situation that requires more attention, and more focus, which you would not otherwise have in a stress state had you not taken that recreational activity. So it can give your mind a break to eventually enhance your focus for when you do get back to work. Another big one is proper sleep. And proper sleep is immensely important. Just as I said with meditation, proper sleep, the internet and scientific literature is very dense with why proper sleep helps us improve our quality of life and why it particularly helps us improve our level of stress. So the basic idea is that a lack of proper sleep can essentially, what it does is it imbalances something called the circadian rhythm, which in itself leads to an array of health consequences and higher levels of cortisol and depression. So, your circadian rhythm is in check if your sleep schedule is in check. So improper sleep, circadian rhythm imbalance, that leads to health consequences and depression and anxiety and insecurity. So having that in check is extremely important. But the main idea is that when you're not rested, you're stressed. It is a type of physical stress. It's physical exertion, and it's exertion even if you're not exerting yourself physically. Because if you're not rested, then any level of physical exertion, even a very small level of physical exertion, will be deemed as too much for you to handle. And that would release cortisol, and that is the stress hormone. And therefore, you're in that same cycle of putting yourself in a stressful situation. So for those of us who are basically stressed due to, let's say, depression, one could say that fixing your sleep schedule can actually put your circadian rhythm in check and make you it can chemically put you in a better spot to tackle your depression, because it would sort of reduce the extent to which these hormones are released, which are responsible for depression, like cytokinin and so on and so forth. But also for those of us who are academically oriented, and perhaps academics are something that is stressing us, it's very interesting to note that, well, it's not interesting, it's sort of even obvious that if you're not well rested, then your brain is not well rested. And if your brain is not well rested, you are privy to having this idea of brain fog, right? You can't pay attention properly because you just don't have enough, you're not rested enough, right? It's too heated up there still. And so if you don't have a solid 8 hours of sleep, or 6 to 8 hours, 7 to 8 is what 7 to 9, I believe is what I recently read. 7 to 9 hours of sleep is what is needed. And if you're going below that, I think 6 is tolerable to certain extents, but if you're below that, then I'd say, you're putting yourself in a position where you're apt to having brain fog, and perhaps your circadian rhythm isn't in check. And it's not just the hours of sleep, it's getting to sleep at the same time and waking up at the same time every single day, and exposing yourself to sunlight. Another thing and this is sort of the last thing here, because we've covered about 7. Another thing is cognitive therapy. And cognitive therapy is a special type of therapy that essentially specializes in helping people who are stressed, in helping people who are depressed, and people who have depression because they're stressed, a very focused type of depression. Cognitive therapy can do for you what a friend would. Like I said before, I mean, they would expose your thought, the fallacious parts of your thought pattern, because they are an unbiased spectator. But the idea with participating in that activity with your friend is that your friend may themselves be stressed, right? They themselves may be inexperienced, or inexperienced in the sense that they may not have the proper tools or advice for you that can help you alleviate either the situation that is causing you stress, or perhaps stress itself for for psychological reasons. So when you're seeking out cognitive therapy, you're putting yourself in the, you're associating yourself with a person who is not only that unbiased spectator, as we saw with friends, but you're also putting yourself you're putting yourself in the socialization of someone who, in the presence of someone who is experienced and who's well read on how to handle your situation, and they can actually take those techniques that are standardized for everyone and gear them towards how they would best fit in your personal situation. And so that's also a very, very good resource to seek out. But it's also about accountability as well, because if you're academically stressed, then perhaps you're not able, perhaps you're procrastinating, perhaps you're not able to meet out your obligations in an organized manner because you're accountable to yourself. Now, if you're accountable to someone else, then that makes you a little more worried, because you're almost concerned about what the other person would think. If you make an external pact with someone, it's far more effective than making it with yourself, unless you have a high sense of pride. But that can also help in relieving academic stress, and stress in general. So I hope that you enjoyed the breakdown of 7 methods of how you can reduce your stress. These types of techniques, utilizing these types of techniques, have helped me tremendously, and hopefully they can help you. Thank you so much for watching.